no identification of self-remission, no interference with the social development of a said planet, no references to space or the fact that there are other worlds or more advanced civilizations. This is Starfleet's General Order Number 1, the Prime Directive. And that's what we're talking about today on Strikes Our Fancy. I'm Captain Rob, and with me today I have...
Chief Scientific Officer Caleb.
Ensign Craig.
Holodeck Waste Extractor, James.
Oh, no.
Does the holodeck extract waste?
It's a Lower Decks reference.
Oh, okay.
It's for the waste left by the holodeck users.
There's waste on the holodeck?
Yeah, if you do certain things.
Caleb, what do you think people do on the holodeck?
Yeah.
Have fun and shenanigans that aren't nasty.
You've never seen a Star Trek episode.
The very first episode... No, it's the second episode that features the holodeck of Next Generation. Heavily implies that there is sex on the holodeck.
But they can't outright say it because it's CBS.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. But materials there are leavings.
There's leakage on the holodeck.
And I'm going to extract it.
Yeah. You can, not even remove. Not removal, not like custodian, like extractor.
Extractor.
Implying it's in something.
Gross.
But if you haven't been able to tell by now, we're talking about Star Trek. I'm here under duress,
Which is not something that we usually talk about on this podcast.
I think Rob is extremely happy this episode. I don't think besides the one episode we talked about, that one episode of Star Trek, I don't think we've had all of us here to talk Trek together. Mm-hmm. And it took one man, it took a holodeck extractor to bring us all together for this.
I'm going to extract it.
Nice. Yeah, James, you should tell us a little bit about your background with Star Trek, because I think us regulars have established our kind of standing orders and experience with Star Trek. But so, what does the show mean to you up front?
Well, I think what attracted me to Star Trek was just like how everyone's treated like as an equal, and I really like the politics within Star Trek.
Okay.
So I think that's just really what pulled me in, because I grew up a Star Wars fan, and you can like both, obviously, and there's beauties in both, but if I had to pick one, it's Star Trek, and I just think there's a lot more to it.
Sure.
That gets me into it.
And how many of the shows have you seen?
I'm mainly original series. Like, I like what they did in the 60s. I like what they were trying to do there.
Right on.
Next Gen, Voyager, bits and pieces, Deep Space Nine, and then the new stuff. But I have not seen Picard yet.
Okay.
But the new stuff that's been coming out.
Nice.
Any interest in Picard?
I think once it's done, yes.
You just want to binge it? You don't want to see it like week over week?
Well, I mean, like what happened to Strange New Worlds, I watched it as it came out, and I'm just missing it. So, yeah.
All right, fair enough.
I have never seen him more depressed than when it went off the air last year.
Really?
So,
I mean, that was a sad time, especially ending it with, spoilers, especially ending it with the death of Hemmer.
He died?
They really...
No, I'm just kidding.
It's just a really, really big emotional toll from the final episode. And then that, was great. Was that the last episode, or was that second to last?
Second to last. And then the Ghost of Christmas Future episode, as I call it. When Pike sees his future self.
Yeah. And then, we get our... we ride the high of Strange New Worlds, and then it's done. What a shame.
Well, to bring us back to task a little bit, Rob, you so graciously introduced us to General Order Number 1. So we have an idea of what it is on paper. But as someone who's less inclined to be involved in Trek, what does that mean in general? What is the Prime Directive?
Well, the quickest answer is it is a non-interference policy. Usually, the Prime Directive is invoked when dealing with a species that is not warp capable, that they don't have necessarily knowledge of other alien species and of the wider universe around them. And that's where things get tricky with it, because occasionally The Prime Directive is very clear when it's a pre-warp civilization, no contact is allowed to be made. But occasionally, a pre-warp civilization will have already been contacted by another species or inadvertently to the Federation. And that's where a lot of the questions of it come from.
Things get gray.
Yeah.
Well, and James, you brought this topic to us initially.
I did,
So, I mean, do you have some strong feelings to come out the gate with?
Well, I think ultimately the Prime Directive serves a purpose both ways, right? It protects captains from, they don't have to interfere. Mm-hmm. There's a law that says we don't want you to do that. So they can keep their distance.
Okay.
And then you can flip it around on Starfleet, right? So if the captain does violate the Prime Directive and it benefits Starfleet, they might look the other way.
You're saying it's good for them that they might look the other way, or you're saying it's good for that they have a deniability clause, like, oh, that captain acted on his own.
And that's the way it's probably mainly going to be used. And Starfleet could be like that. They weren't supposed to do that.
We might agree with what happened, or we might like what happened, but we're going to throw that captain under the bus.
I think it gives the captain a space to back off, and it wouldn't be Star Trek if they didn't interfere with it, right? If they didn't violate it, like a lot of the episodes wouldn't have happened. But with Starfleet, it'll give them, deniability too.
I'm thinking of the intro, and this wouldn't be a Prime Directive situation, but I'm thinking of the intro of Lower Decks when the ship comes across a Borg cube fighting some Romulans. It just leaves. Peace. That's not our deal.
Not our problem. That's interesting, James, that you take it from a deniability perspective, both from a captain and from the organization as a whole. That they can cite something and be like, we don't want to get involved. But you're saying you think it's more of a soft rule. It's like you can use this to get away with not being involved, but if you really want to, we're not really going to care.
Well, I think like I said, soft rule. I don't know. I think if it benefits them, I think they're more willing to look away.
Okay,
but I think if you interfere, it's probably going to go sideways more often than not, which is where people get in trouble.
I think it might have been Captain Janeway. Maybe it was Cisco. One of them said Starfleet doesn't want officers who follow orders directly. They want officers who know when the orders are wrong and when the directives need to be bent.
But then what's the point of the directive?
Oh, did you just get ready to ask that? No. I mean, yeah. What's the whole point of the damn thing?
Well, it's to give you a baseline of what you should do in usual situations, but it's not meant to be binding. It's not meant to say, hey, if you do this, automatically you're out. You're not in Starfleet anymore. It's to say, here's when you should and shouldn't intervene, but also maybe you have a situation where you do need to intervene. So here's the thing about the Prime Directive. It's simple to state what it is. Don't interfere. But the Prime Directive has 47 sub-directives.
Jeez.
It is, and they're obviously never set on screen. But, the Prime Directive is a huge piece of work that allegedly, the greatest minds in the Federation have spent time thinking of.
So what gives a captain a right to supersede what some of the greatest minds in the Federation have come up with?
Well, like you said, it's that gray area. The Prime Directive, despite its scope, doesn't include every possible situation. How could it?
I do just want to say quick, I'm throwing a yellow flag on non-canon rules and sub-directives. We have one Prime Directive that was mentioned, none of this in literature stuff.
No, the 47 sub-directives, that's from Voyager.
Okay. You said it was never mentioned on screen. I'm just saying. I was like,
it's never mentioned what they are. It's some throwaway line where I think it was Janeway was saying something along the lines of, They were having a Prime Directive type situation, and she said something like, "I've read all 47 subdirectives. There's nothing about this situation."
But what's the point of such an arbitrary rule that kind of really doesn't help anybody in the universe?
Well, before we get to that, I'd like to have just a quick round the horn. What are your thoughts on the Prime Directive, good or bad? Is this a force for good, or is it a negative thing?
I'm for the Prime Directive, but I think like every rose has its thorn, every rule has its exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Caleb?
I am vehemently against the Prime Directive. I think it's a moral...
Wow.
Like, it's morally reprehensible to stand away when people need help. Is that not a thing? If you were to leave a family stranded in a flooding car, I mean, that's kind of similar to what happens.
I mean, it's a sci-fi trolley problem.
Yeah.
That's really what it is.
Yeah, frequently that is where a Prime Directive episode lands is, it's a trolley problem. Craig, what do you think?
I think that the Prime Directive is fundamentally hypocritical. I think you can't have an organization dedicated to exploring and then say, ho, but don't actually go on those planets. Like, that doesn't make any goddamn sense.
Agreed.
I think it's a high ideal that even they realize they don't achieve. They're like, oh, it makes us feel good, but we're if you don't follow it, it's okay. Like,
well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It is an ideal. And yeah, they don't always achieve it. Star Trek Insurrection famously opens with a Prime Directive violation, but it's accidental. A crew was on a planet. They were disguised. They were hidden in a deer box, observing a planet, and they ended up being found out. And curses! We broke the Prime Directive. It turns out that the people on that planet actually had regressed. They knew about warp travel. They just didn't like technology.
They just said, fuck the universe.
Yeah.
Well, I have a comment on that, Rob, but you got to tell us, what are your thoughts on the Prime Directive? Good or bad?
I think overall it's a force for good. I did, Caleb, for a very brief moment in time, I felt the same way you did. That, yes, when the Prime Directive ends up letting a species die, well, that's clearly a bad thing to do. But in the world in which this was all written, I read actually in an article on Forbes, of all places, that the Prime Directive was written kind of in response to the Vietnam War. And it was specifically made as a non-intervention policy. So to kind of curb down on rampant colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Kind of an anti-imperialism mentality.
Exactly, yeah. Because consider, let's say the entire Federation took the Vulcan stance on emotions. And they said, hey, emotions are bad. Everybody should not have emotions, or they should work to purge their emotions. If the Federation didn't have a non-interference policy, be no reason for them not to go to every planet, especially developing planets, and say, hey, live our way. This is a better way. Look what we've accomplished. And a lot of times the Prime Directive really comes into focus with Paleolithic or very early societies that are still shaped by a kind of superstition and mysticism. You don't want a starship appearing with magic and, people appearing out of thin air telling a superstitious backwoods planet how to live their lives.
Wait, Rob, are you saying that if you had access to highly advanced technologic objects, you wouldn't try to become worshipped as a god?
I didn't say I wouldn't. I just said it would be a good idea not to.
Isn't that also the plot of the majority of original series episodes?
Becoming a god was who watches the Watchers.
Doesn't Kirk fight many gods over the course of 3 seasons?
They do. And probably some of that is the basis of the Prime Directive, because in the original series, Prime Directive wasn't. I don't know if they ever even said Prime Directive.
Well, let's defer to our resident original series experts.
Yeah.
Well, I think the one that's most cited is Bread and Circuses. It's where they go on this planet, and basically it's Rome. It's like the Roman gladiators, but it's 20th century technology. So it's not like Romans in the Romans' time. It's Romans in the 1960s.
Okay.
So they're Colosseums to television, but they're not like warp capable. But anyways, they beam down and they know that they have to do the Prime Directive. So like Kirk says a line, Spock says a line, and Bones says a line. And that's probably one of the more cited original series for the Prime Directive, because they outline 3 clauses for it.
Gotcha. Rob, you made a point just a bit ago. It was that the idea that the Prime Directive is an ideal to strive for, this non-interference, that we're truly going to try and explore the universe with as light a hand as possible, I think is kind of what you were trying to say. Mm-hmm. Or that was my takeaway. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah. And yeah, you had asked something along the lines of, well, how can we explore if we're not going down to the planets? Well, I would say to that, if they go down to a planet and make themselves known, by doing that, they've changed the outcomes of what would happen on that planet. I mean, imagine if during World War II, aliens had made themselves known.
Sure.
How different would the world be today?
Yeah, fundamentally different. But so I'm going to take it to the opposite extreme, though, because if the Prime Directive is the ideal to strive towards, why would they even create situations where they can accidentally be discovered? If it's such a bad thing to interfere even accidentally, even just the knowledge of their presence, it could be catastrophic.
Yeah.
Isn't that inherently selfish?
Well, so typically the Deerblind situation from Insurrection is not how a typical Prime Directive story starts. They usually start either with like a shuttle or something needing to make an emergency landing on a planet, or there is another species interfering with a planet, and the captain has to wrestle with, is that part of this planet's natural course, or should we stop that?
Okay. But I feel like, though, that didn't answer my question, though. That taking the situation of the Deerblind experiment, let's focus on that specifically. That means someone along the process or some committee within the Federation said, yes, we think the risk to this native population is worth us studying them. Even though the Prime Directive, the modus operandi of the entire organization, is to not interfere, they decided that the risk was worth it.
So generally, the Deerblinds go well. The reason that this one failed was because of the intervention by another warp-capable person.
Okay.
So, like, the technology that keeps them hidden, the Federation feels like that is sound enough that unless you know where that Deerblind is and know precisely where to shoot it with a phaser that the people on this planet won't have, it is safe. So, the Federation does keep themselves out of situations where they're going to be discovered. Like, had that been a post-industrial planet, they probably wouldn't have done that, because there would have been a chance that someone would have noticed the, electromagnetic interference or whatever. And on those planets, they typically don't go down. They might send someone down surgically altered to look like one of the aliens, but that has only been shown to happen when the Federation is preparing for first contact.
So what is the point of all this? like the Prime Directive in essence. So you're out there exploring. The whole point of these 5-year missions or whatever is exploration, like Craig said. And if we can't interact, what's the point of having a doctrine that says we can't interact? What's the point of being out there in the first place? Again, explore strange new worlds. We can't really do that.
Well, I mean, like you can interact, right? I mean, like, let's say you just can't like change their course, like their predestined course. And obviously, when you're out there exploring, right, like you already changed it because any interaction with you is interaction they wouldn't have if you weren't out there.
Yeah. So
right. So what determines what's
when you say
at that point?
What's the point of exploring? It sounds like your opinion is that the Federation is hopping from pre-warp civilization to pre-warp civilization and not interfering with them. But in reality, they're exploring phenomenons and new types of stars and quite a few subspace ion storms or whatever. But also they are meeting other species, but they will not come into contact with another species that can't get beyond their own planet.
But isn't even the act of observing something changing something? Like, isn't that a scientific principle? So even the act of observing these species that are pre-warp, isn't that kind of changing their destination even a little bit?
No, because planets don't really operate on quantum mechanics. Like that quantum interference is not affecting the course of a planet.
I mean, you leave one footprint on that planet, Rob. The next thing you know, you got people saying they're Sasquatches.
That could be.
But did that change their predestined course?
Yeah.
I'm just implying that Sasquatch is an alien.
I also say the best Star Trek episodes, they always just find themselves in a situation. And that's by most Star Trek episodes in my experiences. They're out there doing their own thing, and then they inadvertently or advertently come into contact by doing their own thing. And then they find themselves in this predicament, and they have to find a way to, how can we keep them from not like, how are we not going to like alter their course, but like we're kind of already here. We found ourselves in this situation.
So the Prime Directive really works on a narrative level as opposed to a realistic level.
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to get there, but yeah, like the Prime Directive is a writer's excuse to make conflict, to create a moral dilemma. It doesn't work at a functional level. Like, it just doesn't.
I don't know. Does it?
Well, here's a quote from Captain Picard. The Prime Directive is not just a set of rules. It is a philosophy, and a very correct one. History has proven again and again that whenever mankind interferes with a less developed civilization, no matter how well-intentioned that interference may be, the results are invariably disastrous.
And I can agree with that anti-colonial mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I agree that if we were out there exploring the stars, I can get behind that. But this idea that, like, we're not going to interfere, but we're going to observe, or we're going to put up deer blinds, or we're going to...
Caleb kind of tasked himself with it, but I gave him this episode to watch. It's an episode of Star Trek Enterprise called, I think, Dear Doctor, in which there are 2 sentient species on a planet. And it's kind of like a humans Neanderthal situation. And a sickness is going through the current dominant species. And the Enterprise thinks that they could synthesize a cure.
Mm-hmm.
But the Doctor thinks that's not right because the current dominant species is using the other species as slave labor. And had the Enterprise never shown up, the dominant species would die out and the other species would probably rise up and become the dominant sentient life on that planet.
Okay.
So is it right to save them? Is it right to save one species and condemn the other one to slavery until such a time as, if ever, the first species realizes that this is wrong?
And that's the beauty of the Prime Directive, because it gives the captain that I mean, and that specific episode is the doctor that was advocating for that because Archer wanted to give that medicine because in the moment you can make an argument morally right at that exact time, but when you take big picture, the morally right thing is probably just let nature take its course in that specific episode. But that was before the Prime Directive was a thing, because this is like the first warp capable ship that's out there. So Starfleet's still in its like infancy stages. And Archer says, I don't have the exact quote, we're probably going to have to develop a rule that like tells me what to do in this situation.
Sure.
So that's where I was saying like the Prime Directive would give that captain that space to back off and be like, this violates my law. I can't interfere.
To me, it just sounds like you guys are advocating genocide. I'm just going to say it out loud.
Well, is it genocide? Because had the Enterprise never shown up, that is the course that would have happened.
The moment they showed up, yes, it became genocide once they allowed it to happen.
Yeah, this is, I think, kind of what I was getting at as well, is like the choice that is made by the Federation to go out and explore inevitably create situations where they either now have knowledge or are inserted into a situation. But the Prime Directive is this rule that this ideal that they're trying to achieve that kind of tries to remove them from the rest of the universe. It says like, oh, well, we have to let things take its natural course. Well, the Federation is part of the universe. It's part of the galaxy. It is part of the natural course at that point.
And if you're using the term predestined, who's to say that we weren't predestined to arrive at this planet to help?
So you think that the Federation should go through space exerting their will on every other planet they come across?
I am not arguing for that. I'm saying
because you're saying that the Federation is morally obligated to act on their sense of ethics, regardless of the ethics of the planet in which they would be interfering in.
I'm not saying that it is desirable or that they should be imposing their ethics. I am saying that the ideal behind the Prime Directive is to remove themselves from the universe while they're putting themselves in a situation to be in the universe.
The ideal behind the Prime Directive is to not fuck things up in the universe. But then, the ideal is to allow other species the space to come up with their own set of ethics and morals and right and wrong, and moreover, their own ability to solve problems.
I would posit that it changes things if the species itself asks for help and we still deny them because they're pre-warp.
Well, so that has actually come up in a few episodes where a species they send out like a subspace communication that is a general distress call. Because they know that there is something coming that they can't stop. You know, usually it's like a comet or something. They know they can't stop it. They have reason to believe, even though they don't have warp travel, they have reason to believe that there are other species out there that could help them. And I think in those situations, Starfleet does help.
Like, James, you had a thought.
Well, I was just going to say, it's not really building off Rob's point there, but it's building off Caleb's, where if someone reaches out for help, like this isn't Star Trek per se, but the Orville, Caleb, you showed me a clip, and there's a great quote in there. And the quote is, technology and societal ethics have to progress hand in hand, each one supporting the other incrementally. Anything else is begging for disaster.
The argument comes from, I showed you that, by the way.
You did. Thank you, thank you for giving me a point.
I gave you that bullet. The scene itself is they've just rescued this girl from a pre-warp civilization who knows nothing about aliens, but she's asked for asylum, and so she's given it. And she finds a synthesizer on the ship, and she's like, just one of these would help my planet, because it's basically 21st century Earth.
Sure.
That's the quote Kelly gives her, like, your technological advances have to evolve hand in hand with your own societal ethics. Otherwise, they're not growing with each other. If we just handed you this, you wouldn't know what to do with it.
So imagine if we had a replicator today if some all-knowing species just came and dropped one down on the president's desk. Our society is not ready for that. I mean, for one, I think a replicator is an incredibly energy-intensive thing, and I just don't think we could power one. But I don't think we're in a situation where if there was a magic box that could make anything you wanted, that our civilization would be able to handle it.
How do we make money from this?
Exactly. Yeah, imagine what it could do for us, but imagine what it actually would do.
Rob, it sounds like you want all the children in the world to go hungry tonight. That's the argument I'm hearing right now.
No, I would love to have.
I don't think he's saying that's what he wants. He's saying that's what would happen.
Yeah.
If the situation, like, it wouldn't actually fundamentally change anything.
Yeah.
To oversimplify and draw from Marvel, like, with great power comes great responsibility. How these things are applied, how these advances, and how we got to these advances, to try and uplift a lower civilization, that is, likely going to go poorly. I do agree with that. But I just, to my very original point when you asked, what do I think about the Prime Directive? I still think there is some hypocrisy in there. That it's this goal, or it's this ideal that they're trying to follow, but also they get to pick and choose when they care.
Well,
like, I don't think that the stories that we see in these shows actually match them striving to reach that ideal.
Well, I mean, that's the nature of storytelling, right? If they reached the ideal, that just wouldn't be a very interesting story.
It's all about the journey.
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely.
It's an interesting quandary because the question is interesting. Is it right to interfere to save somebody? And Craig, I mean, you said it right off the bat. It's a science fiction trolley problem.
Because you don't know what's down the other track. You can see the immediate.
Well, I mean,
track. You don't know what's.
Is it the captain's choice to make?
Yeah.
And that's the purpose of having a Prime Directive, is to say, no, it's not the captain's choice to make. But then also, I don't know, I would assume it's written in a way that is slightly open to interpretation. Again, just so if a captain does violate the Prime Directive because he thinks it's right, that we can get away with it.
It sounds like the Prime suggestion.
Yeah, right. Well, to James's point at the very beginning, is it a moral deus ex machina? Like, I get to do this thing when I want to do it, and I can point to this directive for when it works for me in either situation, whether I intercede or not. I can always use this to back up what I wanted to do.
I don't think it's that open, right? You couldn't, to go back to the replicator example, you couldn't drop a replicator on a planet and say, well, yeah, that was the right thing to do. And because I interpret the Prime Directive this way, that's good. But let's say there are two warring nations on a planet and the Klingons give one side a replicator. Well, then it's an open question. Should the Federation give the other side a replicator? Or should they not interfere? But there's already been interference.
I was going to say, wasn't there a Next Gen episode specifically about that?
I know there's an original series episode.
Yeah.
They gave, there's two factions at war with each other. The Klingons gave one faction weapons, and the other faction doesn't have weapons. And so how Kirk gets involved is he stumbles upon this, like any good Star Trek episode, right? Stumbles into this moral dilemma. Mm-hmm. And how he answers the dilemma, he just gives the other side weapons. So he just armed the other side, so now they're back on equal terms.
And does the Enterprise just kind of skitter off after that?
Yeah, do they follow up on
that? Yeah, they just leave.
Really, what could they do? It's not reasonable to expect the Federation to come in and confiscate all the advanced weapons from the other side. They're just not going to be able to do that.
It's a Cold War allegory, but I don't know what the moral of the story is.
The moral of the story is that the Klingons shouldn't have interfered.
Prime Directive. Boom.
Yeah. They don't have one.
What's interesting is when you find yourself in that situation. So like I think of like Voyager, there's what is it, like 70,000 light years or something, million light years away for they're in the Delta Quadrant, we're in the Alpha Quadrant. Janeway is violating the Prime Directive, and she's giving away technology for ways to get home faster. And then it ends up biting her in the butt because I forget exactly what she gave away. I think it was like holodeck technology. And people she gave it to used the holodecks to figure out ways to like attack and defeat people. And that's what happened to them.
It just helped them kill better.
It did.
So I'm going to jump on that tangent a little bit, James. So something that I find kind of implausible and tough to swallow a little bit, this idea that all Federation officers are so fundamentally instilled with this righteousness over the Prime Directive. How do you indoctrinate someone like that in like 4 years of school to like really drive home like, hey, don't do this? It seems for the most part across all these different ships that they actually do follow it for the most part. But then you've got a situation like Janeway where she's like, well, this is what we need to do right now, and we're just going to do it. But there was no conflict, I'm assuming, internally on the ship saying, should we or shouldn't we?
Well, I mean, I think it's always a moral dilemma for her because they're on a Federation starship, and she makes it very clear that they're going to try to do things the right way.
Okay.
The best they can. But it's a long journey, and you're going to find yourself in situations like any good Star Trek series does.
In a Prime Directive episode, there is a lot of contention among the crew usually about if it's right or wrong to interfere. I don't remember that specific example if the crew is upset about it, but yeah, there definitely are situations where the captain is saying, no, we're going to not interfere because that's the Prime Directive, and the rest of the ship is adamantly against that, and they say, no, we need to interfere in this situation.
So it comes down to a vote, essentially.
No, because there's a captain.
Yeah, no, it doesn't come down to a vote. It comes down to, can somebody convince the captain? Or occasionally, is somebody just going to act?
These ships are not democracies. You know, there's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
It's a cheerocracy.
Yeah. A what?
Bring it on reference. I'm sorry.
There are occasions where the captain says, no, we're not going to interfere, and somebody interferes anyway, and now the captain has to untangle that web.
What's the space equivalent of keel hauling?
just airlocking.
Yeah. That'll deal with the problem real quick.
Yep.
And I was going to say, to your point, Craig, where you're asking like how in 4 years of school or whatever it takes to be this captain, or however long it takes to get through Starfleet Academy,
sure,
how do you indoctrinate someone to follow the Prime Directive? And it's an oath that they take when they become captain.
Well, there's that portion of it, but there's also, that's just kind of the societally accepted thing to do in the Federation. Even non-Starfleet ships are expected to not interfere. They're not bound by the Prime Directive, but it's just the culturally accepted thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just a quote that basically says, like, for a captain, it's you're going to sacrifice. You'll be willing to sacrifice your life and the life of the crew to uphold the Prime Directive.
And you say, how in 4 years do they instill you with this? Well, in 4 years of academy training, you're not making Prime Directive decisions. You're just on a ship. And then you're on that ship for years and years and years before you make it to a point where you might be the one making that choice.
You've gotten to see your captain violate the Prime Directive a bunch,
Yep.
and you know when it's okay to violate the Prime Directive?
Exactly.
I'm just curious on, like, how often does it happen? Is it just these 4 ships that come across these, or is it happening it must happen all the time if there's a directive.
Well, a lot of the episodes start with somebody not in Starfleet has made contact with a pre-warp civilization. And now Starfleet kind of has to deal with it.
Well, I did just hear something that interested me. Like, there are non-Starfleet ships.
Oh, yeah.
And it makes sense. I just never
absolutely.
thought about it.
Yeah.
Like, you could just go whizzing about in space all willy-nilly. There's no rules for you. It's fine.
Yeah. 7 of 9 on Star Trek Voyager. Her parents they're not part of Starfleet. They just got a ship and went out hunting Borg.
That is awesome. That sounds like its own show.
I mean, they lost.
No, it would be cool though, because their search of the Borg happens before first contact with the Borg. So they're out there like searching down these rumors of a species that nobody's seen.
But I think the creator, Gene Roddenberry, a lot of his ideas and stories were written with the notion that this is an ideal human society. This is like, we fixed all of our petty problems. Now, what does it look like when we take that mindset and go out and explore the stars? And so I think that's part of why they, I think, brush away from actual like violent conflict kind of ideas, in my opinion. Because like the moral and philosophical questions are what we should just like, that's what we have to strive for when there's nothing left to physically take.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I was always sad that like that in the Next Gen, what was it, like season 2, where there was going to be a civil war plot, and then Gene Roddenberry was like, nope, absolutely not. Like that's not my Federation. I'm like, what? Come on, like people are still people. That bugged me.
A little bit, yeah. I get where you're coming from there.
Yeah, it's like the idea that like everyone who's in the Federation is apparently, even though they may not be perfect, they are so fundamentally imbued with this societal norm that like, oh, we're going to do good. It's just like, that's not humanity as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think also where I feel like this Prime Directive, to tie it back, the Prime Directive feels a little hypocritical because it's just like, that's not people. That's not how people are motivated.
But at the same time, if we got a replicator now, like to tie it back, like way back, like 20 minutes ago, we wouldn't, it would completely change our course. So that's exactly where the Prime Directive comes in. We're not ready for it. We're not at that understanding that they are in the, when this happens.
Fair enough.
It's an ideal to strive for.
Bunch of bull crap.
Yeah. And so maybe it's not a perfect rule. Maybe it is a little bit hypocritical because people will inevitably interfere and do harm. But since when have all of our rules not been hypocritical to some extent? If we all agree that it's wrong to steal, but isn't that a little bit hypocritical if you're hungry and you don't have any food?
You deserve 19 years in prison.
Yep.
24601.
I just want to make a point real quick because you mentioned way earlier that like Gene Roddenberry took inspiration from the Vietnam War, and it sounds like isolationism is on the menu for Starfleet, is what they're hoping for. Is that really an ideal for an idealist society? To me, it sounds like a doctrine for isolationism.
No, I think you're willfully misunderstanding me there. It's not isolationism. It's non-interference.
There's an inherent judgment. If you're below us, then we don't want anything to do with you.
But if we can take something from you,
but if you're above or equal with us, then we'll talk.
Okay. If we can gain something from you, we'll talk.
It's not even that. I mean, consider that. So here's the thing. The Federation doesn't have cloaking technology. They have the technology to make cloaks on their ship. They don't do it because they're the good guys, right?
I thought they didn't do it because it would start war with the Romulans.
Well, that's the in-universe reason given after the fact. But initially, it was an edict from Gene Roddenberry. The Enterprise doesn't hide because the Enterprise are the good guys.
And how many fictional people have died because they could not hide?
A lot.
So we've been talking about Prime Directive the whole night.
Yeah.
What is it that strikes your fancy about the Prime Directive? Like, why do you hold to it? What is it about the Prime Directive that you hold to?
Because it's a challenge. Like, you encounter it, and a lot of times violating it's the morally right thing to do. But sometimes not violating the Prime Directive is the morally right thing to do. So I think it's just this conundrum, and you can look at it from both sides of the fence. There's an original series episode called The Simulated War, and this has always intrigued me.
That's a great episode.
It's one of my favorites. It's basically Enterprise comes across, and this world's at war with two countries at war or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been at war for like 1,000 years. And instead of launching missiles and shooting bullets, it's computer simulated. And so they do a simulated strike. They determine how many people die. And then that many people go to an annihilation chamber and then actually die.
Jeez.
So Kirk comes across this and he's like, whoa, this is not great. And then the Enterprise is targeted for destruction. So him and all of his crew have to go report for annihilation at like the next morning or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Which he held the oath that he would sacrifice himself and his crew to uphold the Prime Directive. And what he ends up doing is he destroys the computer. And he condemns the two countries to launch missiles and shoot bullets at each other. The true cost of war, because otherwise the war is never going to end. Mm-hmm. So it's a complete violation of the Prime Directive, but you can make an argument it was morally right. Easy choice is to run away. But I always say with the Prime Directive, if you're in, you're in. You can't be half in. If you're going to go do something, you have to do it all the way.
They hold you to your convictions. That's what you like about it.
Yeah.
Because that wouldn't make for an entertaining show. Where like, oh, we messed up. We're going to skedaddle. Like,
see ya.
If you're in, like, you have to either fix it or just not get involved whatsoever.
Yeah.
Those are your two choices. And so I think that's what's interesting.
Rob?
Look, man, if you have the opportunity to intercede and you choose not to, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. However, like James said, you need to be damn sure that you're right.
As I was reading up to talk about this tonight, there are a lot of opinion pieces out there that really state that the Prime Directive is just there to really make the captain think about what they're about to do.
Mm-hmm.
The captain's still going to do what the captain's going to do, but they have to really, really think about the consequences of their actions. But does anyone have a nice bow to put on this? Because I sure don't.
It's a nice dramatic narrative hook.
Yeah.
Real life scenario wise, I don't think it holds any weight.
I agree, Caleb. I think it is an interesting narrative hook. James, to your point, it creates very interesting moral dilemmas that are interesting to watch. They're engaging. And it is. I think the whole goal is to make you, the viewer, wonder, what would I do? What is the right answer in this situation? Which, in that regard, I think it is successful.
I don't want to think. I just want lasers to go pew pew.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you want to watch Star Wars.
The wrong sci-fi show.
Rob, do you want to wrap it up?
Prime Directive is a force for good, but it can be used for evil. So, thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts, dear listener, on the Prime Directive, please let us know. You can find us at StrikesOurFancy on Instagram, or at strikesourfancy@gmail.com, or our website, ourfancy.site.
And I'm going to keep plugging the voice messaging. You can see in the details below this episode, there's a link. You click it. You have to sign up, which sucks. But once you do, anything you want to say to us, you can say to us. We'll get it. We'll respond to it, and it'll be great.
Well, folks, it sounds like I've been demoted to First Officer Rob. And with me, as always, are
Kardashian Caleb.
Yeah, I think I'm leaving the Federation. I'm now Smuggler Crow.
Ooh, there it is.
And our special guest this week.
I am now importing waste into the holiday.
It's just job security, right?
You take it in, you pack it out. It's a good national park slogan, and it's a good slogan here too.
Hey, James, do you have any online presence that you'd like to plug in this podcast?
You guys can follow my Facebook. It's just mainly sad memes.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll do it.
Nice. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was great to have you. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I'll talk about Star Trek Under Duress, but if I'm gonna, it's great to have you along for the ride.
You know, you guys give me shit about it. I also talk about Star Trek Under Duress. It's usually not me bringing it up.
This would be a great podcast name, Star Trek Under Duress.